They thought she was just a quiet old woman with a garden. Easy to ignore, easy to mock. So when a group of teens vandalized her backyard, their parents laughed it off. Boys will be boys, they said. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Because this woman didn't yell, she didn't beg. She opened a folder, read an old lease, and changed everything. By the end of the week, 3 families were packing. What was in that contract? And how did one forgotten garden become the center of a neighborhood reckoning? This isn't just about flowers. It's about what happens when silence holds the power. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning sun crept across the edge of the narrow backlot where Dorothy Lyle had spent the last 7 years of her life in near total quiet. House 6B sat at the end of a short gravel path behind the clustered row of townhome rentals, mostly occupied by families that moved in and out without noticing her much. She didn't mind. Her days were quiet by design. Her knees ached more than they used to, and her eyesight had softened at the edges. But she still woke early, brewed her tea without sugar, and checked the soil along the edge of her small garden with practiced fingers. That morning, the kettle hadn't even cooled when she stepped outside and paused. The garden fence was gone. Not broken in parts, not toppled gently. Gone. The soft gray pickets she'd painted by hand 3 years ago disassembled and strewn in jagged pieces across the grass. Her zinnias had been crushed flat in some places. Tulips uprooted entirely, their bulbs tossed into the dirt like they were garbage. The bird feeder was snapped in half at the neck, and the small hand-painted sign that had once read Lyle's Garden in faded blue was lying upside down in the mud. Dorothy didn't say a word. She stood still in her house slippers, arms loosely by her sides, the early morning air cool against the back of her neck. A neighbor's dog barked faintly somewhere 2 units down. A delivery van hummed up the street. She bent down and picked up the sign, wiped it gently on her apron, and tucked it under her arm. She didn't cry. Inside, the kettle whistled. She turned it off, poured her tea, and sat at the small table that faced the garden window. A breeze caught the torn curtain, lifting it gently, revealing the flattened patch of marigolds by the bench. She sipped, slowly. Then she got up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down an old shoebox filled with papers. Some typed, some handwritten, some with the faded ink of legal templates last edited in the early 2000s. She sifted through them with methodical care, setting aside envelopes and receipts until she found the lease. It was a thick, yellowed copy with the Lyle name typed at the top, and a date, July 12, 1981. A renewal was stapled to the back, signed in 2003. At the bottom of the second page, in clean, unambiguous text, was the clause. Dorothy reached for a pen. Her handwriting was slow but steady. She didn't draft complaints. She didn't demand apologies. She didn't call the property manager or post angry messages in the neighborhood group. She wrote 3 letters in total. The first went into a stamped envelope addressed to the landlord, Halverson Management Company. The second she folded neatly and placed beside the lease agreement. The third she copied by hand again and slipped into a plain manila envelope, sealing it with a faint press of her fingers. Outside, the wind had shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees behind the units, the sound of skateboard wheels clacked on pavement. Voices loud, laughing, adolescent echoed faintly through the alley behind her fence line. She didn't look out the window. Instead, she returned to her chair, opened a leather-bound journal, and on the next blank page, dated carefully in the corner, she began to write, "I believe in consequences, not anger." That was all. Then she turned the page and kept writing. Each line was deliberate, unhurried. A small record, not of revenge, but of clarity. She listed what had been broken. She noted the time. She marked the angle of the footprints, some large, some small, pressed into the soil near the fence posts. She included the model of the green water gun one of them had left behind in the garden bed, still half buried in the petunias. She made no assumptions. She simply recorded, and when she finished, she folded the pages, placed them in the envelope, and added one last thing before sealing it: a copy of the tenant clause underlined in blue. Dorothy didn't need anyone to get angry for her. She just needed them to read. The neighborhood had no name, only a string of numbers that lined each rental unit along Sycamore Lane. It wasn't the kind of place anyone photographed. Vinyl siding, mailboxes leaning slightly, driveways cracked in patterns everyone had grown. Used to stepping over, families moved in, stayed for a few years, and moved out again. Nobody remembered who had lived there 10 years ago. Most didn't know who lived 3 doors down now. Dorothy Lyle had been there longer than anyone. Her lease was signed in the summer of 1981, back when the surrounding lots were still open fields and the street was just gravel and intentioned. Now, she was the quiet woman in 6B, the one with the bird bath, the soft gray curtains, and the little wooden bench in the backyard that faced a square patch of soil. Most assumed she was a widow. Some thought she might be a former teacher. A few didn't know she was still alive. Her backyard wasn't large, just a narrow strip of land the width of her unit, hemmed in by hedges and the back fences of neighboring homes. The kind of space landlords called green space in brochures and forgot about entirely after move-in. But Dorothy had cared for it with a kind of attention most people reserved for old diaries or treasured recipes. She had no grandchildren, no clubs, no standing commitments. What she had was morning light, good soil, and time. Every morning, she slipped on her faded gardening gloves, filled the old tin watering can, and walked the same gentle path from her porch steps to the first row of lavender. She spoke to them softly out of habit, more than belief. She knelt, despite the ache in her knees, to press her hands into the earth. She didn't plant for beauty. She planted for steadiness. Marigolds for pest control, sage for scent. Tomatoes because she liked how they looked, growing on the vine. Sometimes a squirrel would watch from the maple tree above the fence. Sometimes the same orange cat from 4A would curl up on the sun-warmed corner of her bench. Dorothy never shooed it away. The children from Units 7 and 8 would cut through the alley behind her fence on the way to school, their backpacks swinging behind them, headphones in, voices raised over morning cartoons and half-finished homework. They never looked over the fence. Never saw the rose she had weeded the day before. Never noticed how she had trimmed the rose bushes, just enough to let the peonies breathe. Most of the adults didn't look either. The backyard gardens weren't visible from the street. If anything, people saw the chipped paint on Dorothy's back door and assumed the yard beyond it matched. Even when she installed the little fence herself, measuring each picket, painting each one the same soft white tit, went unnoticed. It had taken her 3 weeks to finish. Nobody commented. Not the family across the lot. Not the mother who jogged past her kitchen window each morning. Not even the property manager, who once stood beside the mailbox without recognizing her. As she watered a potted fern nearby, she didn't mind. There was something sacred in being unseen, something protective. Until the morning, the fence was gone. Now the space was different. It wasn't that the destruction itself had been so massive. It wasn't the size, it was the fact that something had changed, where the fence had once created. A quiet perimeter. Now, there was exposure, and with it came notice. That afternoon, a man walking his dog paused by the alley. He glanced toward the open yard. He saw the broken feeder, the flowers lying bruised in the soil. He frowned, continued on. A few hours later, a teenager from Unit 9 hesitated at the edge of the lot, chewing on his straw, his eyes scanning the mess as if it were a riddle. Didn't expect to see, for the first time in years. Dorothy's garden was being looked at, but not because of what had grown there, because of what had been done to it, and because the woman who had always kept her head down was now quietly beginning to look up. The video wasn't long, just under 30 seconds, but it played on loop across 4 phones as the boys sat beneath the bleachers after practice. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the field, and the only sound competing with their laughter was the metallic clatter of someone shooting hoops nearby. The footage had been filmed the night before, grainy, lit only by porch lights and one flickering street lamp. It showed a shaky camera angle pointing toward a small backyard garden. There was a brief scuffle of feet, the sound of someone laughing off camera, and then the image of a foot kicking through a row of tulips. Another hand reached out, yanking a picket from the fence like it was a loose tooth. More laughter. One voice yelled, "Boom!" As the bird feeder toppled and snapped at the base. By the end of the clip, someone tossed a half-empty can of soda over the fence. The video cut off with a blur of movement and the sound of running feet. "Man, did you see her little sign?" one of the boys said between snorts, pulling the video back to the frame where the hand-painted Lyle's Garden sign was face down in the dirt. "She actually named it," another added, shaking his head. What kind of grandma names her weeds? The tallest of the group, Tanar, was leaning against the concrete wall. His arms crossed over his chest, the corner of his mouth turned up like he wasn't fully laughing. But he wasn't stopping it either. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down. "Who's that?" asked Kyle, the leaner one with the track jacket still zipped to his neck. "Dad," Tanner said, "wants to know what time I'm getting home. We've got some dinner with the landlord." "Bored or something?" "You mean the place your family owns," said one of the others. "Basically," Tanner muttered, "the complex is under his company, but it's run through some property manager guy. He just nods and stamps whatever Dad says." "Bet he wouldn't care about some garden," Kyle said. "What's he gonna do? File a plant police report?" They all laughed again. Then Kyle nudged the boy sitting at the edge. Had been quieter than the rest, his thumbs hovering over his phone screen. "Post it? It's hilarious." Landon hesitated. "I don't know, man. My uncle's on the HOA board. He'll freak if it gets around." "He won't know it's us," Tanner said dismissively. "It's just some garden. Nobody even knows who she is." "Yeah," Kyle added. "She's like a ghost. Never talks. Probably didn't even notice." But she had. And the idea that they were invisible, that what they'd done existed only in the safety of their shared phones and laughter, was about to slip through their fingers. "I think she knows," Landon said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Tanner looked at him, eyebrow raised. "What?" "I think she knows it was us," Kyle scoffed. "Even if she does, what's she gonna do? Write a strongly worded letter on floral stationery." Tanner chuckled at that, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He glanced back at his phone, then back at Landon. "Delete the video," he said. "Seriously, if you post it, someone will recognize the houses in the background." Landon didn't move. "I already sent it to Micah," Kyle said. "He's got like 2,000 followers. It's probably gone already." They all went quiet. For a moment, the sound of the basketball echoing across the court filled the silence. In the distance, a sprinkler turned on, ticking rhythmically like a warning. And for the first time since the video was filmed, not one of them was laughing. Dorothy Lyle had lived in Unit 6B since before the street was paved, long before the playground was installed at the end of the lane, before the string of rental townhouses turned beige and identical, before the HOA even existed. Her lease was older than most of her neighbors' mortgages. It had been signed with a pen dipped in careful optimism back when she and her late husband moved into the modest two-bedroom with hopes of building something quiet and long-lasting. The husband had died years ago, cancer, slow and unkind. The marriage had been quiet too, just like everything else Dorothy had ever done. She had no children, never tried. The reasons weren't tragic, just personal. She liked silence, liked clean corners and books lined up according to the Dewey Decimal System, even after she'd retired. For 36 years, she worked as a librarian first at the city's central branch, then later at a smaller satellite one tucked behind the high school. She could still recall the sound of pages flipping in a quiet room, the echo of teenage whispers trying not to be heard, the feel of worn library cards. Signed in cursive by children who now had grandchildren of their own, Dorothy moved slowly now, but not without purpose. Her morning routines were exact. Wake at 6:15, tea by 6:25, a walk through the garden by 6:45, weather permitting. She still wrote letters, still folded laundry with corners aligned, still pressed flowers between pages of old dictionaries and labeled each one in neat script. Most of the neighborhood barely noticed her. To some, she was just the woman who always wore cardigans, even in summer. To others, she was the one who never spoke at tenant meetings, who always voted quietly, and who never put out Halloween decorations. Children had once nicknamed her library lady, though few remembered why. Some assumed she had moved in recently, given how little she engaged. Others thought she'd passed away already, her blinds always drawn halfway, her porch light never on past 9. But Dorothy had never left. Not once. She paid her rent on time, maintained her unit with care, made no complaints, and in doing so, she became invisible, familiar enough to be overlooked, silent enough to be underestimated. Her home reflected her, a stack of hardcover books on the side table, always dusted, a brass lamp with a pull chain, one photograph on the mantel, a black and white image of her parents standing in front of a train station, her mother's gloved hand resting on her father's arm. No clutter, No noise, just quiet preservation. The bird bath in her backyard was a gift from a former library assistant who had moved to Oregon. She filled it with fresh water every 2 days. Birds came, even in winter. Finches, sometimes robins, the occasional blue jay. She made a list, kept track. It calmed her dot, and the notebook always the notebook sat beside her favorite chair. Its cover was dark green, the spine beginning to fray. Inside, observations, notations, names, dates. Not gossip, just details. Things most people wouldn't care to write down. How many times the city delayed waste pickup? Which child rode a scooter without a helmet? When the hedges outside Unit 4 were trimmed without notice? And who left a cardboard box? Behind the recycling bins, Dorothy didn't keep the notebook to expose. She kept it to remember because if no one else was going to care about the patterns, about the order of things, then someone had to. That morning, as the sun filtered through her blinds, she opened the notebook to a clean page. She wrote the date. She wrote what she saw in the garden. She noted the missing fence, the disturbed soil, the crushed lavender. And then, very carefully, she wrote one more line, 3 sets of footprints, one larger than the others. Soda can beside the feeder, unfamiliar brand cherry vanilla. She closed the notebook and set it back in its place. She didn't need to knock on doors. She didn't need to shout or demand. She had the lease. She had time, and she had always known how to read between the lines. The neighborhood WhatsApp group had started during the first spring of the pandemic. At first, it was a lifeline neighbors offering canned goods, trading disinfectants, checking in on the elderly couple in 5C who no longer opened their windows. But over time, it had become something else. A place where small grievances got smoothed over with emojis, where complaints about barking dogs turned into jokes, and where certain names began appearing more often than others. Tanner, Kyle, Landon. The group was private and invite-only. Most tenants were in it, especially parents with kids in the nearby school. Some used it to sell strollers or hand-me-downs, others to borrow hedge trimmers or warn about broken streetlights. And more than a few used it to keep tabs on who was doing what and whether it fit within the unspoken rules of Sycamore Lane. Dorothy Lyle, of course, was not in the group. She had never owned a smartphone. Her flip phone sat on its cradle by the landline in the kitchen, next to a worn address book and a stack of utility receipts rubber banded together by month. She did not download apps. She did not ask to be added, and no one thought to include her. But Dorothy saw the screenshots. It started when Carol, who lived in 5A with her 2 teenage sons, printed something at the office and accidentally left it in the community printer tray. The document included a full transcript of a group chat mistakenly pulled from her WhatsApp desktop. It was meant to be deleted. It wasn't. It sat there for an hour, folded neatly beneath an invoice for pest control, until Mrs. Temple from 4D noticed it. She didn't comment. She just slipped it into her purse with the rest of her things. And later that evening, when she brought Dorothy her mail like she did every other Tuesday, she hesitated at the door. "I think you should see this," she said, placing the envelope on the counter. "Someone left it by mistake, but it mentions, well, you'll see." Dorothy waited until the door closed. Then she peeled open the envelope and laid the pages flat on her dining table. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, but the words were legible. The chat began with someone sending a blurry image of Dorothy's garden, taken from the alley the morning after the fence was destroyed. The caption read, "Guess she's not." A fan of late-night landscaping there were laughing emojis, thumbs up, a few gifs. One of the parents replied, "Boys being boys. Better than breaking into cars, right?" Another added, "That old lady always looked like she was waiting for someone to yell at. At least now she has a reason, lol." More emojis. A short video clip. Dorothy paused at that, cognizing the same grainy footage the boys had passed around, a boot slamming down into the dirt. Laughter, a hand reaching for the sign, "Not even a good garden," someone wrote. "She just plants dirt and pretends it's art." And then, near the bottom of the page, a name she recognized. Tanner says his dad owns the lease. She's a legacy renter. He said it's basically her word against theirs. Dorothy pressed her fingers against the table's edge. She didn't react, not outwardly. She just read the page again, slowly, and then she folded it and placed it beneath her green notebook. That night, she watered what was left of her garden. The fence was still gone. The bird bath cracked at the base. Her marigolds were scattered like confetti across the soil. In a second-floor window, light flicked on. Laughter echoed faintly from a balcony across the lot. Dorothy looked up. And for a brief moment, it was as if the entire neighborhood had turned itself inside out. Where once there had been silence, now there was noise. Where there had been disregard, now there was derision. But she didn't call anyone. She didn't write a reply. Instead, she opened her notebook and underlined one sentence from earlier. "That week, I no longer feel safe in my garden." Then she placed a small sticky note beside it. 3 names, 4 addresses, and one phrase written in small, neat letters. "Pattern of disregard, formally documented." She closed the book, clicked off the lamp, and went to bed. The lights across the complex stayed on longer than usual that night. Dorothy never looked out the window. Again, she didn't need to. She already knew what the neighborhood thought of her. And soon, they would learn something about her too. Dorothy kept her original lease in a manila folder marked in blue ink. Documents, Lyle Residence. It sat inside the second drawer of the narrow filing cabinet beside her desk, beneath a stack of neatly labeled tax records and utility statements. She hadn't opened it in years. Not because she'd forgotten it existed, but because she had never needed to. The document was yellowed around the edges, the staples beginning to rust. The ink had faded slightly, but remained legible, a testament to the quiet permanence of typewritten words. At the top of the first page, her name Dorothy E. Lyle, date of lease, July 12, 1981. Her husband's name had once been listed beside hers, but that portion had been crossed out, initials added in the margin. It was all legal, all tidy. She flipped through each page with the same precision she'd once used in shelving reference materials at the library, slowly, deliberately, eyes scanning for the sentence she remembered from years before. Buried near the back, under a section most people skimmed over, special considerations, long-term tenancy. She read the clause again, word for word. In recognition of continued occupancy beyond 20 consecutive years, the tenant shall retain the right to request an advisory vote on matters pertaining to property conduct, tenant behavior, and community welfare. With the managing board and enforced under standard lease compliance policies, no one talked about it anymore. It had been added back when the property was still privately managed, before Halverson Management took over, before the current board existed, before half the units were even built. Dorothy remembered the conversation with the original owner, a soft-spoken man with a habit of over-explaining everything. He had liked the idea of legacy renters, people who would provide stability. While others came and went, she had asked for the clause when they renewed the lease in 2003. After the HOA had formed and started making decisions without input from older tenants, he had agreed, signed it himself. She remembered because he had said, "Most folks won't care, but it's good to have it written down." Now, sitting at her desk with the lease unfolded in front of her, Dorothy felt the weight of that moment come back. The clause wasn't binding in the way eviction orders were. It didn't grant her direct power, but it gave her something else, something almost no one else on the property had standing. She opened her notebook and copied the clause word for word. Then she turned the page and began a new entry, dated carefully at the top. Advisory vote requested under Clause 7F, as permitted by lease in effect since 1981 and revised 2003. Purpose: review of conduct and policy response to vandalism affecting common and private grounds. She paused. Then she added, request to be submitted in writing to Halverson Management and HOA chairperson. Supporting documentation to follow. Her handwriting remained steady as she composed the draft. The tone was formal, measured. It was not emotional, not angry. She referenced the WhatsApp messages, the recorded video, the age of the garden, and her tenancy. She included photos printouts, annotated by hand showing the damage, the broken fence, the trampled flower beds, the soda can beside the BIRDBATH. She printed 3 copies, one for the property manager, one for the HOA, and one she would keep for her records. Outside, children were yelling. A game of tag or some after-school? Nonsense. Dorothy listened to the rhythm of their footsteps pounding across the pavement. For a moment, she thought about what it would mean to press forward with this. She imagined the meeting, the sideways glances, the smiles that weren't really smiles, the parents shifting in their chairs, talking about forgiveness, about not overreacting. But none of that changed the fact that her rights were written down, signed, dated, filed, and they were still valid. She placed the lease back into the folder, sealing it with a new paperclip. Then she returned it to the cabinet, shutting the drawer until it clicked. Later that evening, as she walked past Unit 9 on her way to the mailbox, one of the teens glanced up from his phone. He looked at her. Just for a second, Dorothy didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. Dorothy descended the narrow wooden steps that led into the basement of her unit, one hand grazing the railing, the other gripping a flashlight. The pull chain bulb at the top of the stairs hadn't worked in years, and no one had come to replace it. Not that she'd asked. The basement was cool, dry, and silenter kind of place. Concrete floor, exposed pipes along the ceiling, and shelves lined with boxes that had remained untouched for decades. Some were labeled, others weren't, but she knew what each one contained by weight and position alone. She called it her library, though there were no books, at least not in the traditional sense. This was a library of records, of forgotten things. Tenant newsletters from 1994, bundled with twine, a copy of the original zoning map from the early 80s. Lease agreements, some hers, some belonging. Two neighbors who had moved away years ago and asked her to hold on to things for a while. No one ever came back for them, but she had never thrown them out. Dorothy set the flashlight on the edge of a shelf and pulled out a gray file box marked HOA Docs Legacy. Inside were old meeting minutes, printed on letterhead. From a time when the association still used full names instead of initials, she scanned the titles Quickly Noise Complaint from 2005, Mailbox Repair Approvals from 2007, and a 3-page petition objecting to a proposed rent hike in 2001. Remembered that one. It had gone nowhere. Tucked beneath the pile was a tenant roster from 2003, printed and signed by hand at the annual meeting. It listed every household in the complex, including the original unit assignments. Dorothy's own name was at the top of the page, marked long-term occupancy. There was a check mark next to it, in red ink. She had forgotten about that detail. She ran her finger across the names, so many of them now replaced by new families and unfamiliar faces. She pulled another box from the lower shelf, heavier than the first. Inside were individual folders labeled with addresses, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. All the way through 10B, some were thin, containing little more than lease summaries and 1 or 2 pieces of correspondence. Others were thicker. 3A, for example, held an incident report from 1999 involving a broken window and an unauthorized backyard structure. Dorothy flipped through it, remembering how the resident had argued that the playhouse wasn't a structure because it had no foundation. The board had disagreed. She reached the folder labeled 6B Her Own. It was fuller than the others, not from conflict, but from continuity. Copies of every renewal, notices of minor repairs, proof of rent paid by check until the complex shifted to online payment. She pulled out a copy of the 2003 lease amendment and held it up to the light. The ink had faded slightly, but the signature of the original property owner was clear. The advisory clause was there: undeniable, readable, enforceable. On the bottom shelf, she found a small box labeled Correspondence, 1986 to 2002. It was filled with typed letters, mostly sent from the original HOA board to tenants. But among them was a memo Dorothy had forgotten she'd saved on announcement from the property manager in 1998, reaffirming the rights of long-term residents to petition for conduct hearings in cases of repeated nuisance or property damage. It wasn't law, but it was internal precedent. And in places like Sycamore Lane, precedent still meant something. She stacked the most important papers together: lease copies, meeting minutes, tenant rosters, that old 1998 memo, and placed them in a new folder. Then she wrote one word on the label: support upstairs. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches outside her window. She took the folder with her as she climbed the stairs, each footstep firm despite the creaking wood. By the time she reached the top, she had already outlined the next step in her mind. She would call Mr. Halverson's office, she would send a formal written request, and she would include copies of everything. Not all of it needed to be read, but she wanted them to. No, it existed. She had been invisible to them for years, but paper didn't forget, and Dorothy had never stopped keeping records. Dorothy waited until the afternoon sunlight had moved off the kitchen counter before picking up the phone. She had already brewed a fresh cup of tea and arranged her documents into 3 neat lease documents, community correspondence, and supporting records from her basement archive. She didn't write a script, but she had a list of points she wanted to cover. Noted in small block letters on a yellow notepad, the phone itself was old, still plugged into the wall with a thick cord that curled like a vine. She didn't mind. The call wasn't about speed. She dialed slowly, carefully reading each number from a business card she had kept for over 20 years. She had slipped it into a dictionary once, not for any particular reason, just something she did when names meant something. Now it sat by the edge of her desk, its corners soft and slightly discolored. The card belonged to Thomas N. Calderon, attorney at law, probate, property, and tenant rights. She had written the word calm beside his name years ago. That had been her impression when he was 17. The line rang twice before connecting Calderon and Baines. "This is Amelia speaking." Dorothy adjusted the receiver. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Calderon, please. Tell him it's Dorothy Lyle." There was a pause, then a flicker of recognition in the woman's voice. Of course, one moment. The silence that followed was brief. Then a familiar voice, deeper now, but still carrying the same measured cadence, came through the line. "Ms. Lyle, I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again." Dorothy allowed herself the smallest smile. "It's still Mrs., technically, but I won't hold that against you." He chuckled lightly. "You were always better with precision than I was." "I still am," she said gently, "and I'd like to ask you for a bit of yours." "Of course," he said, shifting into the tone of someone already searching for a pen. "What's going on?" She didn't start with the garden. She didn't mention the WhatsApp messages, or the boys, or the laughter. She started with the lease, the clause, the way the HOA had evolved without ever officially rewriting the rights of long-term residents. She outlined her timeline of occupancy, her preserved documentation, and the community's recent decline in conduct. Then, after a pause, she added what had prompted all of this. "There was vandalism," she said evenly, "to my property, and to property technically considered part of the shared exterior lot, documented. Yes, photographs, screenshots, video. I also have written confirmation from other residents acknowledging the event occurred and the parties responsible." Dorothy hesitated just for a moment. "I believe I know who they are. I can't prove it entirely without bringing names into it, and I'd rather not, yet that's not what I'm asking for." "What are you asking for?" She took a breath. "I'd like you to review my lease, the advisory clause from 2003. I want to know if I'm still within my rights to request formal action on tenant conduct based on the materials I have, nothing more, not right now." Thomas was quiet for a moment. She could hear him shuffling papers, or perhaps opening a drawer. "You know," he said, "you once told me that justice doesn't always mean punishment. It just means clarity. I still believe that." "All right," he said. "Send me the documents. I'll review them tonight. I'll let you know by morning if the clause still holds weight. Off the record, though, from what you've described, you're not just within your rights. You're overdue for action." Dorothy didn't respond to that. She didn't need validation, just facts. "Thank you, Thomas. I'll fax them over this evening. My machine still works." He laughed quietly. "Of course it does. You're the only reason I ever learned how to fix one." They exchanged no goodbyes, just a polite sign-off and the quiet click of the receiver returning to its cradle. Dorothy gathered the documents, fed them carefully into the fax machine, and watched the confirmation print. Then she returned to her chair by the window and wrote in her notebook, called Thomas Calderon, requested legal review, not enforcement, maintain neutrality, maintain documentation. Watch the tone of the response. She underlined the last sentence twice. Then she set the pen down and watched the garden, waiting for nothing except the sound of the machine printing a reply. Thomas Calderon arrived just before noon, dressed in a charcoal gray jacket and carrying a slim leather case that looked like it hadn't changed much since law school. Dorothy opened the door before he knocked. She had been watching through the curtain since his car pulled in. He smiled, warm but curious, and she stepped aside to let him in without a word. The last time she had seen him in person, he had been 23 and fresh from the bar exam, dropping off a handwritten thank you. Note for a scholarship recommendation she had written during his senior year. He had worn the same kind of expression then, serious but soft around the edges. Her home smelled faintly of chamomile and old paper. She led him to the table where she had arranged the documents in neat rows, each folder labeled in her careful hand. Her teacup sat nearby, already cooling. She hadn't touched it since morning. Thomas sat without prompting, removing his jacket and folding it over the back of the chair. He opened the first folder with a kind of reverence, flipping through the lease documents and amendments like they were pages from a rare book. Dorothy watched him work. He didn't rush. He read every word, occasionally making a note in the small notebook he kept beside his hand. After a while, he looked up. "It's all here," he said. "Your clause is valid." It was never superseded or revoked, and it was signed by the original property owner in 2003. They'd have to rewrite the bylaws and give you notice before they could even think about changing your standing. Dorothy nodded once. UNSURPRISED. Thomas picked up another folder, the one labeled Incident Documentation. Inside were the printed screenshots, the grainy video stills, and her annotated photos of the garden. He didn't comment at first. He just looked at the evidence, taking in the foot tracks, the torn fence, the soda can. His brow furrowed slightly as he turned each page. "This is deliberate," he said. "It's not random. It's targeted. Yes, you've got the names. I've got enough to feel certain, but I haven't written them down." He set the folder aside, then leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Dorothy, I need to ask you directly now. Do you want to pursue this as a legal case? We can file a formal complaint, seek damages, name individuals. If you wanted to go to small claims or even push for mediation, I could arrange it." She didn't answer right away. She picked up her tea and took a small sip, though it had gone cold. Then she placed it down and met his eyes. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because this isn't about money," she replied. "It's about behavior. What was done can't be undone. The fence is broken, yes, but it's not the fence I care about." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "Then what is it you want?" Dorothy looked out the window at the garden, the flattened zinnias, the bare spot where the bird bath used to stand. "I want consequences," she said softly. "Not punishment, just the right weight for the wrong thing. I don't need them to pay. For my flowers, I need them to understand they're not untouchable, that there are rules, and when you break them, something happens." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "You want the board to act? I want them to remember they can." Thomas closed the folders, pressing them back into their original order. "Have my written assessment by tomorrow," he said. "It will state that the clause is enforceable, that your advisory vote request is within your rights, and that your documentation supports a formal review." Dorothy stood, and he followed. At the door, he hesitated. "You taught me to think in steps," he said quietly. "To separate emotion from reaction, you said justice begins where anger stops." "I still believe that," she replied. He smiled. Again smaller this time, more respectful, then he left. Dorothy closed the door behind him and returned to the table. She picked up her notebook, turned to the next blank page, and wrote one sentence. He asked if I wanted to make them leave. I want them to understand why they can't stay." It started with an email from the property manager's assistant. A short message, no bold text, no exclamation marks, just a forwarded letter with Dorothy Lyle's name at the bottom and a single line in the subject. "Tenant requests advisory. Vote." At first, no one on the HOA board thought much of it. They glanced at it, assumed it was about landscaping complaints or recycling bin etiquette, and flagged it to be discussed at the next monthly meeting. But 2 days later, a second message arrived, this one from the Office of Halverson Management, itself marked urgent. Attached was a scanned copy of Dorothy's lease, a letter from her attorney, and a request for confirmation that the advisory clause, dating back to the 2003 lease update, remained active. The chair of the HOA board, Valerie Swan, was in the middle of planning her daughter's wedding when she opened the email on her phone. She read through the lease clause twice, not fully remembering it, even though she'd been a member of the board for 8 years. It was the phrase advisory authority regarding tenant behavior and property conduct that made her pause. Within 20 minutes, she was texting other board members. Did you know 6B can call a vote? Is that the old lady with the garden? Yes, and apparently she has documentation. Attorney-backed, by evening, the group chat had shifted from casual scheduling to full alert. Can she evict people? No, but she can call a vote that puts pressure on the board to act. Is this? About the garden thing, I think she's going public. They hadn't planned for this. Most tenant conduct issues were handled with quiet conversations, a mail here, a courtesy notice there. Occasionally, a formal warning letter, but never anything that made it to the full tenant body. The idea of a public advisory vote, folding chairs in the community hall, of parents asked to speak on behalf of their children, felt like a threat wrapped in paper. Valerie called the property manager. "What's the legal standing on this?" she asked, her voice clipped. "She's not threatening litigation," the manager replied, "but her clause is still valid. The original lease is intact. If she wants to hold a vote, you'll need to schedule it, so we can't deny it." "Phew! Could try," he said carefully. "But her attorney has already sent a review letter. If it escalates, it could reflect poorly on board transparency." Valerie ended the call and sat back, staring out at her manicured lawn. The irony wasn't lost unheard, that a tenant who hadn't spoken at a meeting in over a decade could suddenly force their hand. That a garden no one cared to see was now the center of a slow-brewing storm. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Dorothy had reserved the community room herself. The form was signed. Notices were being printed to go out in mail slots. The board members quietly revised their calendars, postponed dinner plans, moved committee obligations. In the days that followed, several parents sent private messages to the board. They had heard something vague, upcoming vote, something about property damage. Some asked if it was about noise complaints. Others wondered if new guidelines were being introduced. The rumors spread unevenly, with each version more uncertain than the last. Valerie didn't correct them. Neither did the others. The fewer people who understood the weight of the meeting, the better. But when Dorothy dropped off her formal statement to the board officer, one-page summary outlining her request, her lease clause, and her evidence everything, changed. Because now it wasn't rumor. Now it was record. And when the maintenance supervisor casually mentioned seeing boxes of files being moved from 6B's basement to the upstairs sitting room, the whispers began to shift into something else: unease. It had been years since the board faced anything resembling scrutiny. Years since a tenant had challenged process, especially one who spoke so little, and now she had called for a vote. The board didn't panic publicly, but privately. In emails and late-night texts, they asked the same quiet question: what if she actually wins? The notices went out on a Thursday. Folded paper slips slid into mailboxes and screen doors. Printed in standard black ink with the HOA's letterhead and a polite but formal heading, Notice of Tenant Advisory Vote requested by Mrs. Dorothy Lyle, Unit 6B. The body of the message was brief. A meeting had been scheduled. Attendance was encouraged. The topic: tenant conduct and community standards, as raised by a legacy, LEASEHOL, by the end of the afternoon. The chatter had begun at the playground behind Units 7 through 10, where the benches creaked and the sandbox never quite drained after rain. 3 parents stood near the swings, shielding their eyes from the sun and laughing. "I mean, really," said Sarah Wilkes, mother of 2 and part-time event planner. "A vote because some teenagers knocked over a garden." "Come on," Heather Lee, whose nephew Landon stayed over more than he stayed home, rolled her eyes. "I read the whole thing. Advisory vote? What's that even mean? It's not binding. It's just some old lady trying to be important again. She wants attention," Sarah agreed. All that time alone, with her little notepad and tomato plants, she probably doesn't even remember what kids are like. Greg Mathers, father of Kyle, and known in the neighborhood for grilling shirtless in December, snorted. "What's she gonna do? Replant the tomatoes with a lawsuit? Put our kids on trial in front of the HOA?" He laughed at his own joke and glanced toward the cluster of teens loitering behind the basketball hoop. Kyle was there, hoodie up despite the heat, headphones looped around his neck. Greg waved casually. "She's wasting everyone's time," Heather said, "and dragging the board into it for what? Some crushed flowers. Honestly, I'd be more concerned about those broken porch lights than a garden bed." "She loses," Greg said with the confidence of someone who had never read a bylaw in his life. "Even if they hold the vote. People don't want drama. They want peace and quiet. No one's going to stand up and point fingers at somebody's kid in public, especially over weeds. They didn't see the mail slip Dorothy had delivered that morning to the HOA office, accompanied by her attorney's notarized summary. They hadn't heard that 3 other residents, ones with no children and no reason to lie, had come forward, with witness statements each describing what they'd heard that night behind the fence line. They hadn't read the clause in Dorothy's lease, and they hadn't asked what would happen if the vote passed. They only saw the surface, and from where they stood, it looked like an old woman making a fuss. The same old woman who never came to block parties, who didn't wave at joggers, who once left a note on someone's windshield because they'd parked crooked near her curb. She doesn't scare me, Sarah added, pulling her sunglasses down. Let her hold her little meeting. No one's going to show up. Greg stretched, checked his phone, and muttered something about steaks to defrost. He slapped the side of his truck before walking back to his unit. Heather lingered a little longer, watching the kids in the distance. She used to be a teacher or something, right? She asked, as if it only just occurred to her. Librarian, Sarah replied. Why? Heather shrugged. No reason. Just funny how those are the ones who always write things down. They parted ways shortly after, still unconcerned, still laughing, but the notice stayed tacked to the bulletin board outside the leasing office and inside Unit 6B. Underlined notes sat neatly in a binder on the dining table, alongside copies of leases and statements prepared for review. The meeting wasn't for another 5 days, but Dorothy Lyle was already ready. Dorothy began writing just after dawn, while the kettle warmed and the neighborhood was still silent. She had already chosen the stationery the night before, heavyweight ivory paper with a faint deckled edge, the kind that felt like it belonged in a courthouse or a will. She smoothed each sheet against the table, lined up her fountain pen, and began. She wrote 23 letters in total, beginning with the tenants. Each one began the same way: polite, measured, personal without being emotional. Dear Mr. Patel, she wrote on the first, as a fellow resident of this community since 1981, I hope this letter finds you well. She kept the tone warm but firm, never accusatory. She outlined her reason for calling the vote not revenge, not spectacle, but the preservation of shared space, the upholding of mutual responsibility, and the need for a community to remember its agreements. Each tenant letter included a copy of the original lease, clause, and a single photograph. Her trampled garden, not the worst one, just enough to see the crushed violets, the broken picket, and the collapsed trellis. Enough to make the event real. To the landlord, she wrote differently. She addressed him as Mr. Edgerton, not by first name, though she'd known him when his father owned the property. She attached the notarized review from her attorney, highlighted the active clause, and included a timeline of events. She did not make threats. She simply laid out the facts, the signatures, the still binding responsibilities. The letter to city zoning was shorter, more procedural. She noted recent disturbances, minor safety hazards caused by trespassing, and the potential liability issues if shared green space continued to be disregarded. She included a copy of the community layout and asked that they review the property's current zoning, use especially the designation of the garden lot as shared amenity space under the 2003 agreement. Then came the final 3 letters. She placed them in a separate stack, using blue envelopes instead of cream. Each one was addressed to a parent. Not all the parents, just 3. The ones whose children had appeared in the screenshots, the ones laughing on video, the ones she had seen, not just once, but often, loitering along the back fence after dark. She had no need for confrontation. She simply wanted it known that she had noticed. Dear Mrs. Wilkes, she began one letter. You may not know me personally, but I believe our paths have crossed in community hallways and committee sign-in sheets over the years. She went on to describe the evening her fence was torn down, the timeline of events, and her decision not to involve law enforcement yet. She expressed concern, not anger. She mentioned the upcoming meeting and encouraged the parent to attend. I believe our community is best served when accountability begins at home, she concluded. She wrote each letter slowly, folding the paper with clean edges and placing it into its envelope without sealing it right away. The blue envelopes were deliberate, distinct, but not dramatic, enough to stand out in a pile of grocery circulars and overdue utility bills, enough to feel formal. Once all the letters were stacked, She set them beside the door and spent the next hour walking them one by one to each mailbox. She didn't rush. She didn't skip addresses. She walked the full loop of the neighborhood, cane in hand, cardigan neatly buttoned, and slipped each letter quietly into its place. She saved the landlord's for last. His box was behind a locked panel in the leasing office, but Dorothy had the Kodan old courtesy extended years ago that no one had bothered to revoke. She placed the envelope inside, then closed the panel carefully. When she returned to Unit 6B, her hands were a little sore, but the binder was lighter. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched as the neighborhood began to wake. By late morning, the envelopes had started to vanish, one by one. By evening, the group chat went quiet, and the next morning, a new note appeared on the bulletin board. All residents encouraged to attend. Advisory vote will proceed as scheduled. Dorothy smiled, once to herself, then turned the page in her notebook. Mr. Halverson sat behind the same desk his father had used for 30 years, the same desk with the faint burn mark from a forgotten ashtray and the middle drawer that stuck slightly when it rained. The office smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. A stack of rent receipts sat untouched to his left, but his attention remained fixed on the ivory envelope in front of him. He had already read the letter once that morning. Now he was reading it again. Dorothy Lyle's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, deliberate, and calm. She hadn't typed the letter, though she could have. She'd chosen a pen that was her way. The letter was precise, no wasted words, and yet it left no doubt about the weight it carried. She had enclosed a copy of the lease clause, page 7, paragraph 4, highlighted in blue ink. He knew it well, or at least he should have. His father had drafted the original lease with a now-retired attorney. Back when the property was mostly rented to war widows and veterans, when long-term tenants were seen as pillars of stability, the clause had been his father's idea, gesture of respect toward those who'd lived there for decades. It allowed residents with over 20 years of tenancy the right to call for an advisory vote regarding neighborhood conduct and board accountability. His father had seen it as harmless, a nod to goodwill. He never expected it to be used. Neither had Mr. Halverson. He turned to the file cabinet behind him and pulled out the thick folder labeled 6B Lyle, Dorothy. Inside were yellowing copies of maintenance logs, renewal agreements, and the signed lease from 1981. It was all there. Her signature, his father's. The amendment from 2003 was there too, when the HOA had officially been formed and the clause revalidated during a round of updates. He checked the margins. No nullifications, no overrides. Dorothy still held that right. He leaned back and ran a hand over his face. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled, because now, legally, she could force the HOA board to hear her. She could present evidence, collect statements, and call for formal action, not just complaints action. And while the vote wouldn't carry the legal force to evict anyone, it would pressure the board to act, and if they didn't, it would leave them exposed. Worse still, she had documentation. He had no doubt. Dorothy had always documented everything. She had kept the old community newsletters when the HOA stopped printing them. She had filed every parking notice and stored copies of minutes from meetings she never even attended. Mr. Halverson had once joked that she probably remembered the serial numbers on every appliance in her unit. Now he was starting to believe. He picked up the lease again, looked at her name, typed neatly at the top. Dorothy wasn't a problem tenant. She had never missed a payment, never asked for unnecessary repairs. She had tended her garden quietly, helped catalog books at the old community center, and never involved herself in neighborhood drama. She hadn't raised her voice, not even. Now, she'd used the tools she already had. That's what made it harder. He pulled out his phone and called Valerie Sorin, chair of the HOA board. She sent the letters, Valerie asked immediately. Yes? She can't actually make us remove anyone, can she? No, he replied, but she can document everything we refuse to do. And if it's clear we ignored an official advisory vote, we could be liable. If something escalates, even indirectly, it's on record that we were warned. Valerie sighed audibly. I didn't even know the clause was still in effect. Well, it is, Mr. Halverson said, and she's right. She's following the lease. She hasn't gone outside process. She's just used it better than we ever expected. There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Valerie asked, Do you think she'd go all the way with it? I think, he said carefully, that she already has. After the call ended, Mr. Halverson stayed at his desk for a while. Looking again at the envelope with her name on it, he didn't feel tricked. He felt reminded. The lease had always been there. They just hadn't believed someone would ever use it. The knock came just after 10:30 a.m. sharp, impatient. A pause. Then another knock, heavier this time, like someone wasn't going to leave unless answered. Dorothy set down her pruning shears and wiped her hands on a cloth before making her way to the door. She wasn't surprised. She had expected them, just not quite this early. On her porch stood two women, Sarah Wilkes and Heather Leafaces, flushed with a mixture of heat and frustration. Sarah had her arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up like a headband, her mouth tight. Heather looked less, composed, one hand resting on her hip, the other still clenched from knocking. "Morning," Dorothy said softly, her voice calm. "Would you like to come in?" Neither of them answered right away, but when Dorothy stepped aside and held the door open, they entered without thanks. The living room of Unit 6B was spotless, quiet, and smelled faintly of lemon balm and paper. A teapot sat warming on the sideboard. Beside a ceramic jar of shortbread cookies, Sarah was the first to speak, turning halfway to face Dorothy, but not sitting. "We got your letter," Dorothy nodded. "I'm glad it reached you." Heather spoke next, more sharply. "You're calling a public meeting to humiliate our kids?" "I'm calling a vote," Dorothy said evenly. "One that's allowed under the terms of my lease. Nothing more." Sarah took a step forward. "They're teenagers. They made a mistake. And now you're trying to stir up the whole neighborhood over a few plants." Dorothy said nothing. She moved slowly to the side table and picked up a leather folder. She opened it carefully, leafing through a few labeled tabs before pulling out 2 sheets of paper. She offered them without comment. Sarah took hers, scanned the heading, Lease Agreement, Community Conduct Clause. Heather frowned. "What's this?" "Page 7, Dorothy said gently. Paragraph 4. The Advisory Clause. All tenants agree to uphold shared standards of conduct and accountability. If a long-term resident believes those standards have been violated, they may call for a formal review." "This is ridiculous," Heather muttered, tossing the paper onto the coffee table. "You're quoting leases like you're some kind of lawyer?" "I'm not a lawyer," Dorothy replied, "but I've read my lease and yours. They're identical in structure. I've simply asked for the process to be followed." Sarah sat down, finally. Her hands were clenched in her lap. "Dorothy, we've lived here for years. Our kids aren't bad. They were just being stupid. You could have come to us first." "I considered that," Dorothy said, taking a seat across from them. "But this isn't the first incident. Only the first recorded and the only one you—" "My take seriously," Heather folded her arms. "So what this is about revenge?" Dorothy poured tea into 3 cups, slow and quiet, the room filled with only the sound of ceramic and liquid. She slid a cup toward each woman and didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't change. "My husband built that fence in 1985, the same year our son died. I kept the garden after my husband passed. I maintained it every season. I didn't expect children to treat it like a joke. I didn't expect adults to laugh about it in a WhatsApp group." Neither woman responded, Dorothy continued, her voice still calm. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm asking for accountability, not in whispers or side conversations. In the open, with the same visibility that the damage received." Heather looked toward the folder, then at the tea she hadn't touched. Her voice dropped. "What happens if the vote passes?" Dorothy set down her cup. "The board will be required to issue formal conduct notices. If it happens again, leases can be reviewed for compliance, and the community will remember that silence is not the only way to respond." Sarah leaned back, arms crossed again, but her tone was less sharp now. "You really wrote 23 letters?" "Yes." "For flowers?" "No," Dorothy said. "For dignity." No one spoke for a moment. The sound of a clock ticking faintly from the hallway was all that remained. Dorothy took a short breath, looked at them both with no hint of anger, and said softly, "You're welcome to stay for lunch if you like." "I made soup." They declined, but neither raised their voice again. The next morning, just after 9, Dorothy opened her door to find another parent waiting. Not angry this time, just quiet. It was Greg Mathers, a large man with a quick temper and louder voice, but this morning he stood unusually still. His ball cap was twisted backward, his phone in his hand like he hadn't decided whether to use it or not. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Dorothy nodded once. "Come in." He followed her inside, not saying much, glancing around the small, tidy living room as if looking for some sign of what was to come. She gestured for him to sit. He did, slowly, and then folded his hands between his knees. "I didn't come to argue," he said. "Good," Dorothy replied softly. She stood and walked to the shelf near the entryway. A thin folder was waiting there with a labeled tab. "Kyle," she brought it over, set it gently on the table in front of him, and opened it without theatrics. Inside were several printed pages each, one protected in a plastic sleeve. Greg leaned forward, frowning as he saw the first page, a still image from a phone video. 3 teens at night, one kicking over a row of wooden garden fencing. One had a hoodie up, another was laughing. The third, blurry, was holding a phone. "That's not," he started to say, but Dorothy turned the page for him. It was a cropped screenshot from a group chat. The caption beneath the photo read, "Guess Dorothy's gonna have to replant her graveyard, lol," followed by next to the message was a username, Kyle_M_78. There were more pages, each carefully dated, annotated with timestamps and footnotes referencing witness statements. The next section contained a short handwritten statement from a neighbor in Unit 3A who had seen the boys jump the side fence that night. Another from a retired teacher who had walked past the garden the next morning and heard the laughter behind the hedge. Greg sat back, the folder still open. "I didn't know he did all this," he muttered. Dorothy didn't reply. She just slid one more document across the table. A copy of his lease agreement, printed from the original file he'd signed when moving into the community 6 years prior. Page 7 had a yellow tab sticking out from the side. The clause about tenant conduct was highlighted. "You co-signed the lease," she said quietly. "You and your wife." Greg looked down at the page, then glanced back at the photos. "He's a good kid," he said. "He just hangs with the wrong group sometimes." Dorothy gave a small nod, not agreeing, not arguing. "I didn't press charges," she said after a moment, "and I didn't go to the school. I didn't post it online. I used the process I was given. That's all." Greg stared at the folder. For a long time, when he finally looked up, he looked older somehow, as if something had quietly shifted beneath his expression. "Do the others know you have this?" he asked. "Yes. And you gave them copies too." "I did." "Then," he said, "they already know." Later that afternoon, whispers began circulating through the neighborhood. Not angry ones, any more nervous ones. The story wasn't just that Dorothy had written letters or called a vote. It was that she had proof, names, faces, screenshots, signed papers, statements, the kind of quiet evidence that couldn't be talked over or laughed off by early evening. One mother was seen carrying a stack of paper up to the leasing office. Another canceled a play date. One more was heard telling her son sharply to delete a group chat. The WhatsApp group went quiet again, and when the sun set, Dorothy sat on her porch, her notebook beside her, and waited for no one, because at this point the story was no longer about a garden. It was about what people did when they realized the person they underestimated kept receipts. The meeting was scheduled for 6:30, but by 6:10, every chair in the community hall was already occupied. Folding chairs had been pulled from the supply closet. A few people stood in the back. Even tenants who hadn't attended a meeting in years now lingered quietly, some with arms crossed, others clutching printed copies of Dorothy's letter or a lease they had dug out from a drawer that morning. The room, normally used for birthday rentals and bingo nights, had never felt so still. There were no children running around, no cake on the table, just a brittle, expectant silence. Dorothy sat in the second row, close to the front, a soft gray cardigan around her shoulders, and a manila folder in her lap. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was central. No one greeted her with the usual half-wave or distracted smile. Instead, they gave her space, respectful, uncertain space. At the head of the room sat the HOA Board 5 members, each looking more unsettled than the next. Valerie Sorn, the chairwoman, tapped her pen against her notes as if waiting for some last-minute rescue, but there was none. "We'll begin," she said into the microphone. her voice steady but restrained. Tonight's meeting includes 1. Community proposal submitted under Section 8B of the Tenant Code. This section allows for long-term residents to initiate an advisory vote regarding tenant conduct, if supported by written documentation and verified lease status. All eyes shifted toward Dorothy. She didn't stand. Instead, she opened her folder and read aloud in a calm, even voice. My name is Dorothy Lyle, resident of Unit 6B. I've lived in this community since 1981. I'm submitting a formal request for the board to consider action regarding repeated misconduct on property grounds. She paused briefly, not to dramatize, but to flip to the next page. My garden was vandalized. Fence torn down, plants uprooted. This was not an isolated event. Evidence includes digital images, messages, and third-party witness statements. 3 of the identified individuals are minors residing with their families in Units to C, 5A, and 7D. A murmur rippled through the room. Dorothy continued. In accordance with Section 8B of our lease agreement, I request the board vote to issue formal tenant warnings and, should further incidents occur, initiate review for removal of disruptive tenants from the community. She stopped reading and looked up. I no longer feel safe in my garden. The space I've tended for decades has become a target. I believe that silence in response to destruction sets a precedent none of us want. No anger, no raised voice, just the soft cadence of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to document. The board shifted behind their table. Valerie leaned toward the microphone again, clearing her throat. Ms. Lyle, she said carefully, thank you for your submission. Do you wish to submit your documentation to the board for record? I've already done so, Dorothy replied, and held up a receipt. With copies, another murmur. A few people exchanged glances. One man, near the back, nodded slowly to himself. The board took a brief recess in minutes, barely enough time for the whispers to build into nervous speculation. Some tenants huddled in small groups. Others reread the clause Dorothy had cited. A few parents stood alone, arms folded tightly, no longer quite as confident. When the board returned, Valerie's voice was slightly tighter. In accordance with Section 8B, the board will issue formal warnings to the tenants listed should any further violations occur. Lease reviews will be initiated. We recognize the seriousness of Ms. Lyle's concerns. There was no applause, just silence. And then one by one, tenants began to leave. Some paused near Dorothy's chair. One woman from 4B placed a quiet hand on her shoulder before walking away. A man from 1A gave her a small nod without words. Dorothy remained seated. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply returned the documents to her folder, stood, and walked out her steps even. Her presence quiet as always. But something had shifted in the room, and everyone knew it. After the board's formal statement, the room stayed still. Some had begun to stand, collecting bags or folding the papers they had brought, assuming that was the end. But Dorothy remained seated. She didn't move. Instead, she lifted one final page from her folder and waited patiently for the room to settle again. I'd like to request a non-binding advisory vote, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Per the 2003 amendment to the Community Charter, any tenant may call for one when a majority of residents are present. The room hushed. The board glanced among themselves. Valerie opened her mouth to respond, but didn't speak right away. Dorothy's timing had been exact. She had counted the heads. 26 of the 30 units were represented. The clause in question was real, and the vote, while not legally binding, would show where the neighborhood stood. The board exchanged looks, then nodded. Valerie leaned forward again. If any tenant would like to abstain, please indicate that on your form. Dorothy passed a small stack of folded ballots to the first row, each one already prepared with 2 checkboxes: support or do not support. No names, no persuasion. Just the question: do you support Ms. Lyle's request for action on the conduct violations outlined in her statement? She didn't ask anyone to vote a certain way. She didn't explain further. She simply sat back, clasped her hands in her lap, and waited. The ballots moved slowly, hand to hand. Some tenants filled them in without hesitation. Others took a moment, frowning, biting their lips, casting sideways glances. 2 parents whispered to one another before marking their papers. A man near the back held his for a long time before, Folding it twice and placing it in the collection envelope, Dorothy didn't watch them. She looked down at her lap, eyes soft, as though the moment itself was no longer about the garden or the fence, but about something older, something that had taken root quietly over decades. The board collected the papers, shuffled them behind their table, and began to count in full view. There were no dramatic pauses, no gasps, just tally marks and a murmured number. Valerie straightened her back. 18 in favor, she said. 6 opposed, 2 abstained. There was no applause, but something passed through the room, an invisible shift, the kind of silence that meant things wouldn't return to how they were before. 18 neighbors, most of whom rarely spoke to Dorothy, had just voted to support her motion. They didn't do it because they feared her. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't demanded. She had read. She had shown them facts, lease clauses, photos, timestamps, witness signatures. She had respected the process more than anyone else. The opposition didn't leave angrily. They just left quickly. The father from Tennessee took his son by the wrist and walked out without a word. The mother from 5A tucked her ballot deep in her purse and didn't look back. A couple from 7D stood quietly near the coffee table, then slipped through the exit after the room began to break apart. Those who had voted in favor didn't rush to Dorothy. They didn't swarm her with praise, but their silence was different, warmer, heavier, laced with something closer to respect. A few nodded as they passed her. One neighbor, a man she only knew as Alan from 3C, paused beside her chair and said, "That was the most I've ever heard you speak. I'm glad I listened." Dorothy looked up and offered him a small smile. "Thank you." By the time the chairs were being folded and stacked again, the manila folder was back in her hands. She didn't linger. She stood, tucked the folder beneath her arm, and walked out through the side door. The sun had already set, but the porch lights had come on. Small halos of light flickered across the sidewalk. Somewhere behind her, someone was locking the meeting room. Dorothy didn't look back. She had cast no blame, raised no voice, and demanded no punishment. But the neighborhood had spoken anyway, and the vote said everything. The notices arrived just after 8 in the morning. Quietly, no warning. Folded and sealed in white envelopes, slid under 3 separate doors, in Unit to C. The envelope lay untouched for nearly an hour, the morning sun casting a perfect square of light over the welcome mat. Inside, Mrs. Connolly sipped her coffee at the kitchen table while her son scrolled through his phone, unaware. It wasn't until she stepped out to check the weather that she saw the envelope. The handwriting wasn't personal, it was administrative, precise. Typed in Unit 5A, the notice sat between 2 Amazon packages. The mother there had just sent her children off to school and was halfway through loading the dishwasher when she found it. She assumed it was a late water bill, but the logo at the top of the letterhead stopped her Halverson Properties. When she unfolded the paper, the words seemed unreal at first. Notice to vacate 60 days. The reason listed below, breach of conduct code, Section 8B, repeated disruption and violation of tenant agreement. In Unit 7D, the envelope was picked up by the teenage son himself. He opened it in the hallway and stood reading it silently, while his father was still asleep. He read the letter twice. Then, once more, he didn't say anything. He just folded it back up and placed it on the kitchen counter beside the unopened cereal box. The community itself seemed unchanged that morning. Sprinklers hissed across shared lawns. A few early risers walked dogs along the pavement. Vans pulled in and out without pause. But behind 3 doors, something had cracked open, something no one had expected would go this far. At the leasing office, the receptionist fielded 2 phone calls before 9:15. One ended with a threat to contact an attorney. But the documents had already been filed with the local housing board. Everything had been reviewed. The clause in question, old as it was, had held up under scrutiny. The conduct violations had been documented, evidence submitted, a vote recorded, the board had signed off, and the landlord, now aware of what he'd inherited, had chosen not to challenge it. Each letter made it clear the decision was not personal. It was procedural. But to those receiving them, it felt deeply personal. By late morning, word had spread. The WhatsApp group lit up again. Some messages were defensive, others angry, but many were silent observers. Watching the discussion unfold without comment, a few tenants posted questions, Can they actually evict people for that? Was this Dorothy who voted yes? No one answered directly, but everyone knew. The paper trail had been too clear, the meeting too well attended. That afternoon, Dorothy stepped out to water her garden. The fence had been quietly repaired, new wooden slats, standing upright, unpainted but sturdy. She wore her gardening gloves, the same pair she'd had for years. A small blue watering can swung from her hand. A neighbor from 4B passed on her. Morning walk. She slowed briefly and offered a polite wave. "Good morning, Ms. Lyle?" Dorothy looked up, nodded gently. "Good morning." Nothing more was said, but the tone had changed. Across the way, a curtain shifted into sea. A teenage face peered through, then disappeared. By Friday evening, moving boxes had begun to appear. One household stacked them neatly in the garage. Another began sorting toys. In the driveway, conversations were shorter. Some greetings disappeared altogether. Children were quieter outside. No one blamed Dorothy directly, not aloud, but the timing was unmistakable. 3 eviction notices, 60 days. Because of a garden, because of silence that became documentation. Because someone decided to read the lease when no one else had, Dorothy didn't celebrate. She didn't comment. She trimmed her lavender bush and left a saucer of water for the birds. And when the sun set that evening, she closed her gate carefully and returned inside without looking back. By Monday morning, the leasing office door hadn't even been unlocked before the first parent arrived. Mrs. Connolly from DC was standing on the concrete walkway, arms folded tight across her chest, clutching the eviction notice that had arrived. Friday morning, the paper was crumpled, creased, and streaked with something that looked like coffee. But the bolded title was still legible. Notice to vacate -60. Days she didn't wait for the office hours sign to flip. As soon as the door opened, she stepped inside. "This is a joke," she said, holding the paper up like evidence. "You can't seriously think this is enforceable." Over some plants, the leasing manager, Mr. Reyes, remained seated. A calm man in his 50s with quiet eyes and a habit of pausing before every answer, he didn't flinch. He gestured toward the guest chair across from his desk. "You can sit if you like," he offered. "I won't be long," she snapped. "I just want to know who approved this. This is absurd. She's not even on the HOA." Mr. Reyes opened the thin beige folder already waiting on his desk. He had expected them. Inside were printed document scopies of the signed leases, the original tenant agreements, scanned meeting minutes from the HOA vote, and a brief note from the landlord authorizing enforcement under Section 8B. He slid one of the pages across the desk. "Your lease," he said quietly. "Paragraph 4, second page. You initialed it here and signed at the bottom." She didn't look. She just shook her head. "She's a retired librarian," Mrs. Connolly said. "You really think this is about tenant safety? No, she's just mad about a garden." Reyes didn't respond to the accusation. Instead, he flipped to a different page, a printed screenshot from the community WhatsApp group, where her son's name was tagged beneath a video. He didn't say anything. He just pointed to the timestamp. She looked at it, then quickly looked away. A minute later, the door opened again. This time, it was the father from 7D. He walked in slower, but with the same expression, tight-jawed disbelief. "You can't evict us over some vote," he said. "This isn't even a legal process. The board doesn't have that kind of authority." Mr. Reyes slid a second lease agreement onto the table. "The vote isn't the eviction," he explained. "It's advisory, but it triggered a formal review. The landlord approved the action after reviewing the evidence." The father grabbed the paper, scanning fast. "She's using something from the 80s. Who even checks those clauses?" Reyes raised an eyebrow, but didn't answer. "Can't do this," the man repeated. "She didn't," Reyes said. "The lease did." The room fell silent. Eventually, the third parent arrived, the mother from 5A. Unlike the others, she didn't raise her voice. She walked in, sat down in the corner chair, and said nothing. She had already read her lease. She knew the vote margin. She had gone over the video evidence twice. Her son had admitted it. "Is there an appeal?" she asked. Mr. Reyes nodded. "You may request a second review, but the clause is still binding. Your best option is to vacate within the 60 days to avoid further penalties." No one responded right away. Mrs. Connolly stood, folded her eviction notice back into thirds, and left without another word. The father from 7D muttered something under his breath and followed her out. Only the woman from 5A remained. She watched the door close behind them. Then she leaned forward slightly and said, she didn't even yell at him. That's what gets me. She didn't say a word, just sent a letter. Mr. Reyes didn't respond. The woman stood, thanked him, and walked out slowly. The envelope tucked under her arm like a piece of something far heavier than paper. And in the quiet that followed, Mr. Reyes returned the documents to the beige folder, closed it gently, and placed it back in the cabinet with a sigh. The video was shaky, filmed in a bedroom lit by the blue glow of a gaming monitor. The teenager from Unit to C stared into the camera with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. His hoodie was half-zipped, and the background noise of a sibling yelling down the hallway filtered faintly through the clip. He spoke quickly, cutting in with sarcastic laughs and exaggerated eye rolls. So apparently, he began, we're getting evicted. Over flowers. Like actual flowers. Some old lady's garden got messed up, and now my family has 60 days to move. This is real, by the way. He turned the phone to flash briefly on the eviction notice, lying on his desk, then back to his face. Like 80 or something. Doesn't even talk to anyone. And now, the whole neighborhood acts like she's royalty or something. All because of a few trampled plants. You believe this? He ended with a shrug, tossed the phone down, and captioned the post. #evicted, #boomersbewild, #flowergate. It was up for 30 minutes before the comments started rolling in. At first, a few classmates chimed in supportive, joking, sarcastic. Lamau, what? Over a garden. She needs a hobby. Just say you're sorry and fix it, but then the tone began to shift. A woman with a verified badge commented, respecting elders costs nothing. Actions have consequences. Another added, I work in housing law. Lease violations aren't jokes. Your parents should have read the fine print. One user responded with a long thread linking to a screenshot of a local newsletter where a community vote was mentioned. The date matched the one on the notice. That's not just a garden, the user wrote. That's property damage, harassment, and multiple lease violations. Be accountable. The teen replied defensively in the thread, denying intent, calling it an accident, then doubling down, saying it was just kids being kids. That's when someone posted a still from the original WhatsApp screenshot footage from the destruction, showing him laughing while kicking over a potted plant. It was blurry, but recognizable. The likes on the video slowed. The ratio began to tilt. More comments poured in. Bro, you filmed yourself doing it, then acted like the victim. Wild how she's the crazy one, but you're the one vandalizing. Gardens. Imagine being so entitled you think you're wronged for facing consequences. Someone even edited the clip into a short parody with music, pairing it with a fake game trailer titled Eviction Simulator. Boomer's Revenge. It went viral within the hour. The teen took the video down by late afternoon. But it had already been downloaded, re-uploaded, and shared on Reddit under a post titled, Teen Blames Elderly Neighbor After Trashing Her Garden. Gets evicted at dinner, his father said nothing. The eviction notice was still taped to the fridge. His mother scrolled silently through the comments. Jaw tight, phone angled away from him. In Unit 5A, the girl who had filmed part of the garden damage watched the reaction unfold. On her For You page, she didn't repost. She didn't like any comments. She just turned off her phone, stood in front of the mirror, and brushed her hair in silence. In Unit 7D, the boy deleted 2 old posts, then quietly switched his TikTok account to private back. In House 6B, Dorothy didn't see the video. She didn't have TikTok. She didn't follow Reddit. But someone printed the comments for her just a few pages, highlighted, folded neatly in an envelope, and left anonymously on her porch. She read them slowly with a cup of tea, then placed the pages beside her notebook, closed the folder that still held her copy of the vote, and returned to her garden, where 2 small birds sat in the feeder, unbothered by the noise of the world. It started with an email from a school counselor to a parent. Simple, formal, and flagged as urgent. The subject line read, Incident impacting student standing, immediate review required. Inside, it included a screenshot of the video. The teen had posted, followed by a brief message stating the matter had been brought to the administration's attention and would be addressed under the district's Code of Conduct policy. At Lincoln High School, where all 3 teenagers were enrolled, the video had made its rounds even faster than in the neighborhood. By mid-morning Monday, students had seen the TikTok clip, the memes, the stills of the garden destructions. Some even recognized the bird bath that had been cracked. Teachers whispered about it in the break room. One assistant principal had already pulled student files. The damage was no longer private. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. For the boy and to see, the fallout was immediate. He had been scheduled for a scholarship interview on Wednesday, part of a local academic leadership program. He had letters of recommendation prepared, grades above average, and community service hours logged at a food bank. But the committee had seen the video. One of the board members lived in the neighboring complex and had already been briefed on the eviction news. The interview was canceled. The cancellation notice arrived via email that afternoon. It didn't say due to your behavior or in light of recent events. It was just 4 sentences, impersonal and precise. The final line, "We encourage you to reapply next year under our standard eligibility criteria." His mother printed the email and placed it on the kitchen table without a word. The girl from 5A was called into the assistant principal's office during third period. She didn't ask why. She had already heard the murmurs in the hallway scene. The group of younger students huddled over a phone, pointing and whispering. The meeting was short. Her phone was confiscated for review, and her student record was flagged for a behavior code infraction. The violation was clear: willful participation in the destruction of personal property, recorded and distributed online. She didn't argue, she didn't cry, she signed the form quietly, knowing a 2-day suspension would follow. But the part that struck hardest wasn't the suspension, it was the loss of eligibility for Student Leadership Council. She had been vice president since sophomore year. Her advisor sent a brief message: "Due to code violation 6B, your position will be reassigned effective immediately. We appreciate your past contributions." In the hallway after the meeting, she passed a boy from 7D. He didn't look at her. He had his hoodie pulled up, earbuds in. But word had already spread about him too. He was facing internal discipline, not for the video, but for what came after. Screenshots had surfaced of group chats from weeks earlier. Messages where he encouraged others to mock Dorothy's garden. It wasn't direct vandalism, but it was enough to trigger a review of digital harassment. His parents hadn't known about the messages. The school's IT department had been forwarded them by another parent. The digital trail was to clear Dot back in Dorothy's home. She sat quietly that evening with her notebook. She had no idea the school had acted. No idea scholarships were lost, positions revoked. She hadn't filed any reports with the district, but the community had watched, and the schools, like the neighborhood, had policies of their own. Across town, a school board member mentioned it in a staff meeting. Actions reflect character, even when they're outside our walls. No one objected. In the quiet of her garden, Dorothy clipped back a few branches from her hydrangeas. The blooms had started to return. The fence stood firm, and though she hadn't asked for accountability beyond her gate, it was arriving anyway in emails, in meetings, in the lives of those who once laughed without consequence. They came just after 5 p.m. to cars idling by the curb outside House 6B. The first was the blue sedan from 2C, the same one that used to peel down the street with music vibrating the windows. This time, it moved slowly, parked with care. The second was a silver SUV from 7D. Its engine stayed running, then stopped, then restarted, then finally turned off for good. The parents didn't come as a group. They came in pairs, a few minutes apart, each holding something: a small bouquet, a potted plant, a tray of seedlings someone had bought last minute from the nursery downtown. They weren't dressed for formality, but they weren't casual either. They looked like people who weren't sure what expression to wear. Dorothy answered the door after the second knock. She had been expecting them not in certainty, but in rhythm. Things arrived in cycles: letters, meetings, seasons, and now, remorse. Mrs. Connolly spoke first. Her son stood behind her, head lowered, hands in his pockets. "I wanted to say, we're sorry," she said. "He knows it was wrong. We both do." Dorothy nodded once, but didn't respond. "We'd like to help fix it," the woman continued. "We brought some things for the garden. We can replant whatever we damaged." Dorothy looked past her, down the front walk, toward the back fence. The damage had already begun to fade, thanks to her own effort, not theirs. The soil had been turned. Some shoots had taken root again. Others had not. But the garden was not. What it had been, I can pay for any plants, the woman added, even if they're special order. Dorothy stepped aside and gestured to the living room. They entered carefully, glancing around at the neat rows of books, the lace doily on the chair arm, the closed folder still resting on the coffee table, like a silent witness. "I know you probably don't want to talk to us," the man from 7D said, setting down the tray of seedlings, "but we didn't mean for things to go this far. We thought the lease thing was just old language." He didn't explain further. He didn't try to justify. Dorothy stood by the window for a moment before turning back to them. Her voice was quiet, even, not cold, not angry, just settled. "You saw a fence and thought it was a joke," she said, "but to me, it was a boundary, something I built with my hands. After I lost people, after I had to start over, you didn't just step over it, you tore it down." The room was still. Mrs. Connolly started to speak again, but Dorothy raised a hand gently. "I've lived here for decades," she continued. "I've seen children grow up, families come and go. I've watched trees rise, get cut down, planted again. Gardens are like people. They grow where they're allowed to. But if you rip them up, some don't return." The boy from 2C looked up for the first time. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. "It was just some flowers." Dorothy looked at him carefully. "That's how it starts," she replied. From the kitchen came the faint hiss of the kettle. She moved to turn it off, then returned with 3 cups of tea, placed without ceremony in front of the parents. No sugar, no milk, no thank you offered, just space. "We'd still like to help," said the man from 7D, "if you'll let us." Dorothy sat down slowly in her chair, the one with the worn armrest and the faint imprint of her knitting needles beside it. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. Sometimes she said, "We grow after we're uprooted." Then she turned toward the window, where the last of the light was falling across the garden, and said nothing more. The parents stayed for a while longer, waiting for some sign-in opening. A gesture, anything but none, came. Eventually, they left the seedlings on the porch and walked out the door quietly. Dorothy remained in her chair, notebook closed beside her, gaze steady on the yard she had rebuilt without permission, apology, or pity. It began without an announcement. No flyers, no messages in the chat group, no door-to-door invitations, just the slow hum of activity on a Saturday morning. Around 8 a.m., a man from Unit 3A arrived with a shovel. He didn't knock, he simply walked around the side of the house, nodded once toward Dorothy's kitchen window, and started digging near the collapsed edge of the garden bed. A woman from 4D followed 20 minutes later. She brought 3 trays of marigolds, soil still, clinging to the roots, and a thermos of coffee. By mid-morning, there were 5 people in Dorothy's backyard. No one spoke loudly, no one explained why they were there. They just began. Some had never even met Dorothy directly. They knew of her, had seen her on walks, watering the roses in the early hours, always in that same wide-brimmed hat. Others remembered her from years earlier, when she ran the community reading hour in the old library branch before it was turned into a gym. There was no fanfare, just the sound of trowels pressing into soil. Quiet conversation about spacing and sun exposure, and the occasional laugh when someone misjudged a row. The marigolds went in first. Bright, warm yellows and deep orange reds in neat lines along the border where the fence had once been. Then came violets, small patches of lavender, and a pair of new rose bushes, donated by someone who hadn't even lived in the neighborhood for years, but sent them through a friend after hearing what had happened. Dorothy didn't step outside. Right away, she watched through the window for a long time. She didn't recognize all of them. Some were newer tenants. One was a woman who had once borrowed a ladder and never returned it. Another had passed her by dozens of times without ever offering a word. Now they were kneeling in the dirt, placing roots into ground that had once been torn up for the sake of a laugh. Eventually, Dorothy opened the door. She didn't carry a rake or a basket of seeds, just a pitcher of water and a cloth for her. Hans. The man from 3A looked up and gestured gently toward the newly planted bed. "We weren't sure what you wanted here. Hope the marigolds are all right." Dorothy nodded. "They're perfect. No one asked permission to stay longer. They just did." By noon, the beds had been cleared of broken stems. Fresh mulch had been laid, and someone had found the fallen birdbath base and set it back upright. It was cracked in one corner, but someone added a small patch of moss to cover the break, a quiet sort of mending. A child, maybe 6 or 7, wandered in later with her mother. She picked up a small, flat stone, painted it pink with sparkles, and placed it beside one of the marigold rows. "For the flowers," she said simply. Before running back to her mother's side, Dorothy walked slowly along the edge of the garden. She didn't speak often, just nodded occasionally. Sometimes she bent down to press a bit of soil more firmly around a base. Once, she lifted a sprig of rosemary to her nose and held it there a moment longer than necessary. No one asked about the teens. No one brought up the eviction notices or the school consequences. The air didn't need explanation. It was a quiet day filled with quiet acts by people who had watched and waited and now chose to act, without being asked. When the sun began to lower, the last pair of hands finished placing a ceramic wind chime near the porch. It clinked gently as the breeze picked up. The volunteers gathered their tools, thanked Dorothy softly, and left as they came without ceremony. Dorothy stood alone for a few minutes longer, then she picked up the cloth, wiped her hands, and sat by the bird bath. A marigold bloom brushed against her leg as the wind moved through the yard, and somewhere across the lawn, a bird landed without hesitation. The bench arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by truck but by hand. It wasn't largest enough for one person to sit with a book or a mug of tea. The wood had been sanded smooth, stained a warm walnut color. At its center, burned into the grain, were 7 words, grown with memory, not apology. Dorothy had carved the phrase herself. The planks had come from her father's workshop, long disassembled after his passing, but never entirely discarded. For years, she had stored the boards in her utility shed, not out of sentiment, but with a quiet sense that they might be useful again. Now, they formed the backrest and seat of something permanent, something unmovable, not flashy, not new, but made of history. She placed it under the pear tree near the eastern edge of her garden. Just where the sunlight passed through in filtered gold around 4 p.m., that corner had once held a bird feeder. Long knocked down in the storm of '09 and hadn't been used since, but now it had purpose again. They didn't ask why she'd added it. No one commented aloud about the inscription. But they noticed, and they understood Dorothy sat on it that first afternoon with her notebook. She didn't write anything for a while. She simply looked out over the soil, the rebuilt beds, the new shoots rising where the marigolds had taken hold. The chime still swayed faintly from the porch, and the wind carried the faint scent of rosemary and fresh earth. The phrase "grown with memory, not apology" had come to her weeks earlier, in the stillness after the tenants' meeting. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about shame. It was about the kind of resilience that didn't beg to be seen but still shaped the space around it. The garden was never planted for praise. It was planted because something inside her refused to stop growing. Even after years of quiet, she remembered the things others had forgotten. The way the street looked before the new driveways were poured. The names of the original tenants, most long gone. The way her late husband used to call the pear tree, the stubborn one, because it never bore fruit until its 4th year. She remembered reading to children on the old stone steps during summer book hours, long before anyone thought to install playground equipment. The garden was layered with years that only she carried, and now those years had roots again. Later that week, an elderly man from across the cul-de-sac asked if he could sit for a moment. Dorothy nodded. He rested there for 10 quiet minutes before standing up again, nodding once toward the wood, and walking off without saying a word. The next day, someone left a folded note on the bench. "Thank you for reminding us that some things matter." Children passed it on their way to the school bus, and sometimes slowed down, reading the words aloud under their breath. A teenage girl, not from one of the involved families, sat there one afternoon after school with a sketchbook on her lap. She didn't speak to Dorothy, but smiled as she left, leaving behind a small pencil drawing of the pear tree pinned under, a smooth river stone. Dorothy never declared it public. She didn't place a sign or post a rule, but it became a quiet center, a resting place. As summer pressed into fall, the marigolds faded and new bulbs were planted, but the bench remained solid, worn, but whole. A reminder, carved without bitterness, rooted without approval, made from memory, not apology. The moving trucks came in slow procession, staggered over 3 weeks as the once silent units at the far end of the complex opened their doors to new lives. The first was a young couple with a toddler, boxers labeled in careful block letters kitchen. Books, baby clothes, tight with the kind of thoroughness that came from starting over, cautiously. The second was a single mother with 2 sons, the older one already riding his bike along the walkways before they'd unpacked. The third was a woman named Lean and her father, who walked with a cane and nodded politely at every neighbor he passed. None of them knew about the marigolds. Not fully, not yet. But each had heard whispers during the lease signing, hints from the property manager about the importance of community rules, of long-standing clauses, of a resident named Mrs. Dorothy Lyle, who had been here since before the street signs were repainted and the community board had installed speed bumps. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but they felt the atmosphere, calmer, firmer, like a place that had once bent too far and then quietly recentered itself. Dorothy watched the newcomers from her front window without intruding. She made no effort to introduce herself, but she didn't turn away either. Each morning she walked her usual route around the garden, now fully blooming again in late summer rhythm coreopsis in golden bunches, late blooming roses, even a small patch of mint tucked behind the BATH. By the end of the second week, the toddler from Unit 9 waved every time Dorothy passed, sometimes with both hands. The older boy from Unit 11 started stopping his bike to ask her questions, first about the bird bath, then about the purple flowers, then about how long she'd lived in the neighborhood. She answered simply, not unfriendly, just measured dot on. A Tuesday morning, there was a knock at her door. Standing there was the younger of the 2 new boys, perhaps 7 or 8, holding something behind his back. His face was streaked with sidewalk chalk dust, and his shirt was a size too big. When she opened the door, he hesitated, then extended his hand. It was a folded piece of paper, wrinkled and slightly damp around the edges. On it, drawn in red crayon with a green stem, was a single rose, large, bold, a little uneven. "This is for you," he said. "My mom said you like flowers." Dorothy looked at the drawing, then at the boy. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind." "I tried to make it like the one near the fence," he explained, pointing toward the rosebush, blooming just beyond the garden's edge. "Yours is better, though." She nodded. "You did a good job." He grinned and ran off without waiting for more, his sandals slapping the pavement as he disappeared around the corner of the building. Dorothy stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then brought the drawing inside. She placed it on the mantel, above her fireplace, beside a framed photo of her husband, taken sometime in the 1970s. For a long time, that space had held only books and silence. Now there was a child's crayon rose. That weekend, one of the new family stopped by with a basket of lemons from a relative's tree, offering them with a shy introduction and an invitation to a casual potluck they were hoping to organize. Next month, another neighbor brought over an extra rosemary plant after seeing Dorothy tending the herbs near her bench. She accepted both with the same quiet grace she always had, never expecting, but never turning away kindness. No one mentioned the past. No one brought up the teens, the votes, the fence. But in the way the new tenants slowed their cars, waved across walkways, and paused to listen when Dorothy spoke, it was clear that something had taken root beyond the garden. The empty units were no longer empty, and neither was the space between neighbors. Mr. Halverson didn't knock the first time he came by. He hesitated near the steps, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other loosely holding a clipboard. Dorothy was sitting on her bench, trimming a few stray marigold leaves with her small garden scissors, the kind made for delicate snips rather than sweeping cuts. She didn't look up at first, though she had seen him approach through the reflection in her kitchen window. After a long pause, he cleared his throat gently and said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Lyle." She glanced up. "Mr. Halverson, I was wondering," he started, stepping cautiously forward, "if you might have a moment." She nodded once and gestured to the chair at the edge of the garden path. It was one of the folding kinds, nothing fancy, but it had been there for years. He sat with an awkward sort of care, the kind that came from being unsure if one was welcome. He began slowly, choosing each word carefully. "We've had 3 new families move in, and a 4th application just came in yesterday. I'm trying to be more deliberate now, about who moves in, I mean." Dorothy didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "I realized something, going through those old documents and leases. We've been so focused on filling units, keeping occupancy high, hitting those numbers for the ownership group, that we stopped thinking about the kind of community we were building. And frankly, you reminded us." He paused, and Dorothy watched a squirrel dart across the far fence. "So," he continued, "I'd like to set up a formal advisory group. Just 2 or 3 people, long-term tenants ideally, who help review incoming applications. Not to veto anything, but to weigh in, to offer a sense of continuity, of values." Still, she said nothing. Not in disapproval, not in encouragement, just listening. "I'd like you to be the first member, if you're willing," he added. "Your vote already holds legal weight. But your judgment, that's something we'd like to learn from too." Dorothy finally spoke. "And what would that advisory role include?" "Review of applications," he said, "but also general insight. If you see patterns, if you notice concerns, you'd have direct access to me and the board." She nodded, but didn't respond right away. Then she set her scissors down and folded her hands in her lap. "I'll consider it," she said calmly. "On one condition." Mr. Halverson sat up straighter. "Of course. A community garden," she said. He blinked. "Between units 2 and 4, she continued. "There's an unused patch of land, overgrown, unclaimed. It gets good morning light and is near a water hookup. I want that space turned into a shared garden accessible to tenants, managed by volunteers. A space for growing things, flowers, vegetables, herbs, and memory." He opened his mouth, likely to negotiate, but she held up a hand. "No rentals of plots," she said. "No commercial arrangements. It should be a gift from management to the people who live here. Not a transaction, not a PR move, just soil, just seeds, just growth." Mr. Halverson looked down at his clipboard, then back up at her. He was quiet for a moment. "That's very reasonable," he said at last. "I'll get the paperwork started. We'll have to check water access. Probably need a soil quality report, but yes, consider it done." Dorothy gave the faintest smile. Not victory, not pride. Just recognition that something useful had been planted as he stood to leave. He paused at the edge of the path. "You know," he said, "my father once told me that the best landlords are really gardeners. They don't control the growth, they just make sure the roots have enough space and the weeds don't take over." Dorothy met his eyes. "Then let's get back to gardening." The knock at the door was soft, almost hesitant. Dorothy had just placed the kettle on for afternoon tea, the sun casting long amber lines across her kitchen floor. She wiped her hands on a cloth and walked slowly to the door, expecting perhaps a delivery or another neighbor coming by with garden questions. But the young woman who stood on the porch was unfamiliar. Early 20s, maybe. Dark braid pulled over one shoulder, a canvas tote bag slung across her chest. She looked a little nervous, but she smiled. "Mrs. Lyle?" she asked. Dorothy nodded. "Yes, I'm sorry to come without notice," the woman said quickly. Julia, my dad's name is Eric Mendoza. I think you might remember him from a long time ago." Dorothy paused. The name was familiar in the way that a favorite song's opening chord is familiar, just on the edge of full recognition. Then something clicked. "Eric Mendoza," she repeated slowly. "Yes, he was in the summer reading program. Must have been 94 or 95. Julia nodded eagerly. "He said he was 9. You were the one who taught him how to read the Phantom Tollbooth." Dorothy allowed a small smile to rise. "He used to sit cross-legged on the floor and refused to move until we'd finished a chapter." "That's him," Julia said, and then reached into her tote. "He asked me to give you this. He said it's long overdue." She pulled out a copy of the Phantom Tollbooth, hardcover, the corners slightly worn, the spine mended with old library tape. Inside the front cover was a yellowing borrowing slip, and across the top, in Dorothy's unmistakable script, the name Community Lending Library House 6B. Dorothy took the book in her hand slowly, almost reverently. Her thumb traced the edge of the label, faded from years of use. "He kept it all these years?" she asked softly. Julia nodded. "He said it was the first book he ever finished on his own, and that it changed everything. He became a lawyer because you taught him to love reading." Dorothy blinked. Her gaze drifted to the book, and then back to the young woman. "He told me," Julia continued, "that when he came to help you with the lease review, he couldn't believe you still remembered him. It meant a lot, more than he could say at the time." Dorothy gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea?" Julia smiled. I'd love some. They sat by the window, 2 generations apart but sharing the same quiet rhythm. Dorothy poured Earl Grey into 2 mismatched cups, the kind from a long-forgotten china set now kept for guests. She placed the book gently on the table between them. Julia looked around the living room, the shelves stacked with careful order, the light filtering in across polished wood and handmade pillows. My dad used to say this place smelled like cedar and wisdom, she said with a laugh. He wasn't wrong. Dorothy chuckled. I used to keep a cedar block in every bookshelf, said it kept out the moths, but I think it was just habit after a while. Julia sipped her tea and then reached into her bag once more. There's something else, she said. I work with a local literacy nonprofit now. We're setting up neighborhood book hubs. My dad said I should ask you. Dorothy looked up. If you'd like to be our honorary librarian, Julia said, it's just a small project. But we'd love your help, even just advice. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She looked again at the book on the tablets. Pages soft from years of turning, its story still intact. Stories have a way of circling back, she said quietly. Julia nodded. They do. And for the first time in a long while, Dorothy opened a book. Not to file it, not to shelve it, not to sort it, but to read aloud, just the first line. Just enough, just the beginning. Again, the fence wasn't built by contractors or ordered through a catalog. It wasn't white. It wasn't uniform. It wasn't even straight in places, but it stood plank by plank along the edge of Dorothy's garden where the old one had once been trampled. This one was shorter, easier to see over, and entirely. The wood had come from leftover pallets donated by a nearby hardware store. The brushes were borrowed from the elementary art room. The paint was donated by neighbors' half-used cans from sheds and garages, mismatched and uncoordinated, and the artists were children. It began with one Saturday morning, a folding table, a drop cloth, and a note pinned to the community bulletin board. Children's painting project. Come decorate a piece of something that protects something else. No one had to explain further. They remembered that first day, 6 children came. Some were from the new families, others from older tenants. One boy brought his grandmother. A girl brought her sketchbook filled with flower drawings she'd been practicing for weeks. Dorothy stood nearby, quietly supplying water cups and extra rags she didn't supervise, didn't correct, just watched the planks filled quickly. Sunflowers with oversized petals, a string of red and purple hearts, a crooked cat with green eyes. One child painted only clouds, soft blue on white. Another wrote a poem in looping letters across 2 planks. If you plant a kindness, it grows like time and time. Over 2 weekends, the fence came together. Each plank was sealed, nailed into place by 2 volunteers from the maintenance team, and lined carefully along the boundary where Dorothy's garden met the open path between the buildings. No longer just a physical border, it became a shared mural and invitation to notice, not a barrier to keep out. Dorothy watered her zinnias that morning with her usual quiet rhythm, one hand guiding the spout, the other steadying the hose. A butterfly lingered on the marigolds near the edge. The garden was full now, lush and recovering. The damage from earlier in the season long healed beneath new roots. She paused beside the new fence, letting the water trickle down into the soil near the snapdragons. A few steps to her right, a painted sparrow with wide wings stared back at her from one of the planks. The detail surprised her teeny strokes in the feathers, a bright glint in the eye. "Did you see mine?" a voice asked behind her. Dorothy turned. It was the young boy from Unit 11, the same one who had given her the crayon drawing of a rose. He pointed proudly to a plank a little further down, painted bright orange with uneven tulips across the middle. "It's the flowers from the middle row," he said. "I tried to copy the colors." Dorothy looked at it carefully. The tulips were off in shape, and the lines wobbled, but the intent was unmistakable. "They're perfect," she said. He beamed. "We're going to paint more next week. My mom said we can do the backside too." Dorothy nodded. That would be nice. As he ran off to join other kids riding scooters nearby, Dorothy returned to her watering. She paused again at the poem, running a finger gently across the painted letters. Now sealed with weatherproof varnish, if you plant a kindness, it grows like time and time. She thought about the old fence, sturdy, functional, and eventually ignored. This new one wasn't stronger, but it said more. By midday, A few passers-by stopped to read the panels, smiling at the painted bees and dogs, tracing the crooked sunbursts. No one mentioned the vandalism. No one needed to. The story had shifted. The fence was not a reminder of what had been destroyed, was a record of what had grown since. The meeting took place in the same room where the tenant vote had been held weeks earlier, folding chairs in neat rows, a whiteboard that still had faint marker residue from last month's announcements, and a pot of oversteeped coffee sitting lukewarm by the window. This time, it was quieter. No raised voices, no debating, just a sense of quiet finality. The HOA board sat at the front table, Mr. Halverson at the center, reading glasses perched low on his nose. Dorothy sat near the front, as she always did, her hands folded over a lined notepad, though she wasn't writing anything this time. He cleared his throat and held up a single sheet of paper. "We're here today to review the new lease clause," he said, "which will be added to all rental agreements starting this month." He passed a copy to the tenant beside him, who began passing it down the rows. When Dorothy's reached her, she looked at it with quiet attention. Her eyes didn't skim. She read every word. It wasn't long, but it was deliberate. Clause 1 to see. Community responsibility. Pledge all tenants acknowledge that shared spaces, gardens, courtyards, walkways are to be treated with respect and care. Any action that causes intentional damage to shared areas or to the personal space of long-term residents will be considered a breach of community standards. In such cases, tenants may be subject to early termination of lease by majority vote of the resident board. Prior to finalizing this lease, each adult party must read this clause aloud and initial the margin. Dorothy reached for her pen and placed her initials in the margin. As required, DL written with the same careful hand she'd used for decades to sign checkout slips, reading rosters, and index cards. The room was still dot. Mr. Halverson spoke again, this time more softly. "We're not doing this out of fear," he said, "or as punishment. We're doing this because we forgot something. That the way we live together matters more than just paying rent on time or keeping the trash bins in order. We forgot that. Neighborhoods grow just like gardens do. And if we don't tend them," he let the sentence trail off. One of the newer residents, a young father from Unit 4, raised his hand. "Will this apply to new tenants too?" "Yes," Halverson said. "Every new applicant will read and initial it. If they can't say the words out loud, they don't live here." There were nods, some murmurs. A few people flipped the paper over to check the back. There was nothing there, just that single paragraph, short and clear. After the meeting, as the chairs were being folded and conversations trailed off into hallway chatter, Dorothy remained seated, not lingering, just observing. A woman from Unit 2 approached her. "I've lived here 7 years, she said. "But I don't think I really felt part of this place until this month." Dorothy nodded once. "Sometimes," she said, "it takes disruption to remind people they live near each other, not just next to each other." The woman smiled and squeezed her arm gently before walking off dot. Mr. Halverson came over, holding his own copy of the new clause. He asked. Dorothy looked at him, then at the page. "No," she said simply. "It's not about strength, it's about clarity." He looked relieved. "We'll make sure it stays." By evening, copies of the new clause had been added to all. Active leases. The management office left a small stack in the front lobby with a note for review. Signatures required by end of month. Dorothy returned to her garden before sunset. The fence stood bright in the fading light, children's artwork catching the amber hue of dusk. She watered the base of the roses and watched a neighbor's cat tiptoe along the edge. Of the mulch, she didn't say the words out loud, but they stayed with her. If you plant something carefully, it remembers, even if it's only words on paper, even if it's only initials in a margin. By the time the leaves turned gold again, the marigolds had faded and been replaced by winter herbs. The fence remained the same, one painted by little hands months ago. Men's go now, weathered slightly by rain and wind, but still bright. The bench beneath the pear tree still held its place, the words carved into its wood, softened by time, but no less visible. And the garden itself had grown into something else entirely, not just plants. Not just a patch of dirt behind a quiet unit. It had become a place people visited even if they didn't live in the building. Dorothy, now 79, moved a little slower that season. She used a cane when walking to the far side of the garden, but every morning she was out there, not always planting, sometimes just sitting, sometimes trimming or rearranging stones, sometimes reading aloud, quietly. To no one in particular, the children still came. Some of them older now, having moved up a grade or two. A few had begun coming on their own, without their parents. One girl, the one who had once painted the crooked cat on the fence, now brought a journal with her. She sat near the rosemary bush and sketched things. She saw a bee, a leaf, the shape of a cloud. People referred to the garden by name now, though it had never been officially named. Some called it Mrs. Lyle's garden, others the garden behind 6B. But more often, it was simply the garden, capitalized in conversation as if everyone knew which one you meant. Even people new to the complex would hear about it. When they moved in, neighbors would say, "You should visit the garden sometime. It's just behind house 6B. It became a story people told, quietly, without dramatics, a cautionary tale, and a hopeful one depending on who was telling it. Some said there was vandalism, and someone finally stood up. Others said there was a woman who didn't shout, didn't fight, just used the rules, and others simply said there's a garden there now that wasn't always seen, but it was always growing. The teenagers involved in the original incident had long since moved out, their parents too. Nothing else had ever happened to the garden. No new damage, no more drama, just growth, a slow, steady return. Warm day of spring the following year. A small gathering formed without planning. A few families brought lemonade, a mother brought muffins. The children, without being told, each planted one small flower, daisy, a pansy, a violet. Not all the plants matched, but Dorothy didn't correct them. She stood by the gate, leaning slightly on her cane, watching Dot, at one point, at Bueno, older than 5, asked his father, "Why do we come here?" The father crouched beside him, brushing a spot of soil from the boy's jeans. "Because something important happened here," he said. "What kind of important?" the boy asked. The father glanced toward Dorothy, then back to his son. The kind where someone showed everyone how to take care of something, and what happens when you don't. Later that evening, when everyone had gone and the garden was still again, Dorothy sat on the bench beneath the pear tree. The blossoms were just starting. Above her, 2 birds called to each other from opposite branches. She opened her notebook, not to write, but to turn back to a page from last year. A list of things she thought she'd lost. Privacy, respect, quiet. Then, on the next page, a list of what had returned: community, remembrance, color. She closed it again. Even in silence, the garden spoke now, not loudly, but clearly, and every season it was different. The layout shifted slightly with time. The flowers changed. The names on the mailbox labels rotated in and out, but the story stayed in a place where something had once been destroyed. Something better had taken root, not out of revenge, not out of noise, but out of the kind of still strength that doesn't ask to be remembered, and yet is.